It is the morning of May 10th, 1945. The war in Europe is 3 days dead. In the farmlands of southern Bavaria, near the town of Mausburg, the air still carries the faint metallic scent of burned oil and cordite. The sun rises pale and hesitant over a landscape scarred by years of total war. Wild flowers push through the mud along the edges of cratered roads. In the distance, a church bell rings. Not in celebration, but in the slow, mournful rhythm of a continent, trying to remember what peace sounds like. Beneath a canvas tent marked with a white star, a German soldier sits on a wooden crate. His name is Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Müller. He is 26 years old, though his face suggests a man a decade older. His uniform is caked with dirt and sweat, the fabric stiff with weeks of grime. His hands, calloused and raw, rest on his knees. He stares at a bar of soap. It is a small thing, rectangular, white, wrapped in waxed paper with English words he cannot fully read. But it smells clean, impossibly clean, like something from a world that no longer exists. An American corporal, barely 20 years old, handed it to him an hour ago without a word. Just a nod. Miller turns the soap over in his hands as if it were a relic from another civilization. In a way, it is. For Friedrich Müller and the 30,000 German prisoners gathered in the sprawling camps across southern Germany that spring, the soap is the first crack in a wall of ideology that has held for more than a decade. It is the first whisper of a truth they were never supposed to learn, that the enemy they had been taught to despise, the decadent Americans who were supposed to collapse under the weight of their own softness, had somehow built a war machine and a society so vast, so abundant, that even their captives would be given what the Third Reich could no longer provide to its own soldiers. Clean water, hot showers, laundered clothes. These were not luxuries in the new world order the prisoners were entering. They were baseline expectations. And for men who had spent years fighting in the mud of the Eastern Front, who had watched their country's infrastructure crumble under Allied bombing, who had seen their families ration soap and salt and bread until there was nothing left to ration, this realization was more than surprising. It was shattering. The story of what happened to German prisoners of war in American custody is not often told with the weight it deserves. It is overshadowed by the far darker narratives of the concentration camps, the death marches, the Holocaust. And rightly so. But within the strange liminal space of POW camps in 1945, another kind of transformation was taking place. One that was quiet, sanitary, and in its own way, devastating to the ideology these men had carried into battle. The men who arrived at camps like Mausburg, Krems, and Heilbronn had been raised on a narrative of German supremacy and American degeneracy. The Nazi propaganda machine, refined over more than a decade of total ideological control, had painted a picture of the United States as a mongrel nation, racially impure, culturally bankrupt, industrially weak. Americans were soft. They could not endure hardship. They would crumble when faced with the disciplined might of the German war machine. And for a time, it seemed plausible. The Blitzkrieg swept across Europe with ruthless efficiency. The Luftwaffe terrorized London. The U-boats prowled the Atlantic. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. German soldiers marched into battle believing they were the vanguard of a new order, a civilization destined to rule for 1,000 years. But by 1945, that narrative had been reduced to rubble. The Third Reich was collapsing. The factories were silent. The cities were ash. The food was gone. And the men who had once believed themselves invincible now found themselves standing in line, hands raised, waiting to be processed by the very enemy they had been taught to underestimate. Friedrich Müller had surrendered on May 7th, 2 days before the official German capitulation. His unit, part of the remnants of the 6th Army, had been encircled near the Czech border. They had not eaten a full meal in 4 days. Their ammunition was gone. Their officers had fled or were dead. When the American tanks appeared on the ridgeline, no one gave the order to fight. They simply dropped their weapons and waited. The Americans came cautiously at first, expecting resistance, but there was none. Just exhausted men, hollow-eyed and filthy, sitting in the mud. An American lieutenant, a young man from Indiana with a Midwestern accent and an almost apologetic demeanor, told them in broken German to form a line and march west. They would be fed. They would be safe. Miller did not believe him. He had heard the stories of Soviet captivity, the starvation, the forced labor, the executions. He assumed the Americans would be the same, just more efficient about it. So when they arrived at the camp and were handed tin bowls of hot soup, white bread, and canned peaches, he thought it was a trick. Surely this was the last meal before the executions. Surely no nation could afford to feed its prisoners this well while still fighting a war. But the executions never came. The next day, they were fed again. And the day after that. And the day after that. And then they were told they would be allowed to bathe. The showers were set up in a converted warehouse on the edge of the camp. It had once been a storage facility for farm equipment, but the Americans had repurposed it with the kind of speed and efficiency that seemed almost wasteful. Rows of steel pipes ran along the ceiling, fitted with shower heads that sprayed hot water. There were wooden benches. There were hooks for clothing. There were bins for dirty uniforms and stacks of clean towels. Miller stood in line with 200 other men, all of them silent. They had been ordered to strip, to leave their uniforms in marked bags for laundering, and to proceed through the showers in groups of 50. The smell in the room was overwhelming. Weeks of sweat, dirt, fear. Some of the men had not bathed in over a month. Their skin was caked with filth. Their hair was matted. Their feet were blistered and infected. An American sergeant, a stocky man with a Brooklyn accent, stood at the entrance with a clipboard. He checked names, handed out bars of soap, and gestured toward the showers with the kind of casual authority that suggested this was routine. For him, it was. For the Germans, it was incomprehensible. Miller took his soap and walked into the shower room. The pipes hissed and sputtered, and then the water came, hot, clean, abundant. It poured over his head, washing away the layers of grime and exhaustion. He stood there, motionless, letting the water run over his face. Around him, other men did the same. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stood in silence, their faces turned upward, eyes closed. It was not just the water. It was what the water represented. In Germany, by 1945, hot water was a luxury reserved for the elite. Soap was rationed. Public baths had been closed to conserve fuel. The population was surviving on black bread and turnips. The infrastructure that had once made Germany the industrial heart of Europe had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing campaigns. The Ruhr was rubble. The factories were silent. The bridges were gone. And yet here, in an American-run prisoner camp, hot water flowed freely. Soap was distributed without hesitation. Towels were clean and plentiful. The laundry was returned within days, washed and pressed. The floors were swept. The latrines were sanitized. The camp was organized with a level of efficiency and abundance that seemed almost perverse. One prisoner, a former school teacher named Hans Dietrich, later wrote in his diary, "I have spent 3 years fighting the Americans. I have been told they are weak, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. But here in captivity, I see something I was never told. They do not treat us as enemies. They treat us as a logistical problem to be solved. And they solve it with the same abundance they brought to the battlefield. I do not know what this means, but I know I was lied to." The lie was not a small one. It was foundational. The Nazi ideology rested on the premise that Germany was destined to dominate because it was disciplined, unified, and racially pure. The Americans, by contrast, were a chaotic mix of immigrants and minorities, divided by class and culture, weakened by democracy and capitalism. They could produce cars and movies, yes, but they could not produce soldiers. They could not endure hardship. They could not fight a real war. And yet, when the real war came, the Americans did not collapse. They built an industrial machine so vast, it produced more ships, more planes, more tanks, more guns than the rest of the world combined. They fielded an army of millions, drawn from every corner of their sprawling nation, and they fed them, clothed them, armed them, and transported them across oceans with a logistical precision that bordered on the miraculous. By 1944, American factories were producing one aircraft every 5 minutes, one tank every hour, one Liberty ship every 42 days. The scale was incomprehensible. And it was not just the weapons. It was the food, the medicine, the fuel, the clothing. American soldiers ate fresh meat and vegetables in the jungles of the Pacific. They wore clean uniforms in the deserts of North Africa. They drank clean water on the beaches of Normandy. They had access to penicillin, morphine, and blood plasma. They had chocolate bars and cigarettes in their rations. They had mail from home delivered within weeks. The German soldiers who faced them in battle could barely comprehend it. Their own rations had been reduced to bread and ersatz coffee. Their uniforms were threadbare. Their boots fell apart. Their tanks ran out of fuel. Their wounded died of infections that American medics could cure with a single injection. By the final year of the war, German soldiers were fighting with weapons scavenged from the dead and ammunition rationed down to the last bullet. And then, when they surrendered, they were fed. They were bathed. They were given medical care. They were treated not as subhuman enemies, but as prisoners of war entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. It was not mercy exactly, it was procedure. But to men who had been raised on the doctrine of total war, the distinction was meaningless. Friedrich Müller received his laundered uniform 3 days after his first shower. It had been washed, dried, and folded. The stains were gone. The fabric was soft. It smelled faintly of soap and bleach. He held it in his hands and stared at it, trying to reconcile the simple fact of its existence with everything he had been taught. In the barracks that night, he spoke with other prisoners. They compared notes. One man, a corporal from Hamburg, had been given new socks to replace his tattered ones. Another, a lieutenant from Munich, had been treated for a leg infection by an American medic who spoke to him in polite, halting German and administered penicillin without hesitation. A third, a private from Saxony, had been given a Red Cross package containing chocolate, cigarettes, and canned milk. They spoke in low voices, as if afraid to admit what they were realizing. The Americans were not starving them. They were not torturing them. They were not executing them. They were simply processing them with the same industrial efficiency they had brought to every other aspect of the war. They treat us better than our own government did, the corporal said quietly. No one disagreed. There was a symbolic weight to the laundry and the water that went beyond the practical. Clean clothes and hot showers were not just about hygiene. They were about dignity. They were about the restoration of the self. For men who had been reduced to filth and exhaustion, the simple act of being clean again was transformative. But there was something deeper at work. The abundance of soap, water, and laundry services was a direct challenge to the Nazi narrative of American weakness. It revealed a truth the prisoners had been shielded from, that the United States had not only won the war through military might, but through a level of industrial and logistical capacity that made German efforts seem almost quaint by comparison. The soap became a symbol. Prisoners hoarded it. They used it sparingly, trying to make it last. Some sent pieces of it home in letters, wrapped carefully in paper, with instructions to their families to use it only for special occasions. It was not just soap. It was proof. Proof that the enemy they had been told to despise had resources beyond imagination. Proof that the ideology they had fought for had been built on a foundation of lies. One prisoner, a former Hitler Youth leader named Klaus Zimmermann, later described his first encounter with American abundance in stark terms. We were told the Americans were weak. We were told they could not fight. We were told they would collapse when faced with real hardship. But when I was captured, I was given more food in one day than I had eaten in a week. I was given soap, clean water, medical care. I was treated like a human being. And I realized that everything I had been taught was a lie. The Americans were not weak. They were so strong they could afford to be generous. And that generosity was the most devastating weapon they had. The transformation did not happen overnight. Many prisoners clung to their beliefs for weeks, even months. They insisted the Americans were simply trying to manipulate them, to soften them up for interrogation or forced labor. They repeated the old propaganda, whispering in the barracks about Jewish conspiracies and American degeneracy. They told themselves that Germany would rise again, that the war was not truly over, that the Führer had a secret plan. But the soap and the water kept coming. The food kept coming. The laundry kept coming. And slowly, the walls began to crack. Friedrich Müller was among the first to break. He had been a loyal soldier, a believer in the cause, but he was also a practical man, a farmer's son who understood the value of resources, and he could not ignore what he was seeing. The Americans had so much that they could afford to give it away to their enemies. They had so much that even their prisoners lived better than German civilians. He began to ask questions. He spoke with American guards, practicing his broken English, asking about their lives, their country, their families. He learned that the corporal who had given him soap was the son of a factory worker from Ohio. He learned that the sergeant who ran the laundry was a farmer from Iowa. He learned that the medic who had treated his blistered feet was a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania. They were not supermen. They were ordinary people. But they came from a system that produced abundance, not scarcity. Freedom, not control. Opportunity, not obedience. One evening, Müller sat outside the barracks, watching the sun set over the Bavarian countryside. He held his bar of soap, now worn down to a thin sliver. He thought about his family, his farm, his country. He thought about the war, the lies, the waste. And he made a decision. He would never fight for the ideology that had led him here. He would go home, rebuild, and teach his children the truth. That strength is not found in domination, but in generosity. That a nation's greatness is measured not by its capacity to destroy, but by its capacity to provide. That freedom and abundance are not weaknesses, but the foundation of real power. By the summer of 1945, the American POW camps in Germany held over 3 million German prisoners. The logistics were staggering. The camps required thousands of tons of food, water, and supplies every day. The laundry alone was an industrial operation, with mobile units processing tens of thousands of uniforms per week. The sanitation systems were engineered to prevent disease, the medical facilities staffed with doctors and nurses, the kitchens equipped to serve hot meals 3 times a day. It was not perfect. Conditions varied from camp to camp. Some prisoners faced harsh treatment, particularly in the immediate aftermath of liberation when American soldiers discovered the concentration camps, and their fury was raw. But the overall system, driven by military regulations and the Geneva Convention, aimed for order, efficiency, and basic human dignity. And it worked. Mortality rates in American POW camps were a fraction of those in Soviet or even German camps. Disease outbreaks were rare. Escapes were uncommon, not because of brutal punishments, but because most prisoners had no desire to return to a ruined country with no future. Many chose to stay in the camps, working for the Americans in exchange for food and pay, waiting for the chaos to settle before attempting to return home. The laundry, the soap, the clean water, these were not incidental details. They were policy. They were the result of a deliberate decision by the American military command to treat prisoners according to international law, not out of sentimentality, but out of a cold calculation that order and stability were more valuable than revenge. The Americans understood that the end of the war was not the end of the conflict. The peace had to be won as well. And part of winning the peace was showing the defeated enemy that the Allied system was not only stronger, but better. There is a photograph taken in June of 1945. It shows a group of German prisoners standing in line outside a laundry tent. They are clean-shaven, their hair is trimmed, their uniforms are laundered and pressed. They do not look like defeated enemies. They look like men. In the background, an American soldier leans against a truck, smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He is not guarding them. He is simply there. The photograph is unremarkable. It is one of thousands taken during the occupation, but it captures something essential about the moment. The prisoners are not being punished. They are being processed. They are being reintegrated into a new order, one that does not require their destruction, only their compliance. And the tool of that reintegration is not violence, but abundance. Soap, water, food, clean clothes. The simple, undeniable proof that the system they fought for was inferior in every measurable way. Friedrich Müller returned to his village in October of 1945. The farm was still standing, though the fields were overgrown and the barn had been damaged by shelling. His wife and 2 children had survived. They embraced him in silence, too exhausted for words. He unpacked his belongings, a rucksack, a canteen, a jacket. At the bottom of the pack, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a single bar of soap, worn down to almost nothing. His wife looked at it, confused. "Where did you get this?" "The Americans," he said. She turned it over in her hands, smelling it, feeling the smooth surface. "It's beautiful." He nodded. "It's more than that. It's proof." "Proof of what?" "That we were wrong." The legacy of the American POW camps is complex. For many Germans, the experience of captivity was the first time they encountered a version of the West that contradicted Nazi propaganda. It was not a sudden conversion. Ideology is not so easily dismantled. But the cracks were there. The soap, the water, the food, the medical care. They planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the years to come. In the decades after the war, Germany rebuilt. It did so with American aid, American investment, and American ideals. The Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into the reconstruction of Europe, including West Germany. The goal was not just to rebuild infrastructure, but to rebuild ideology, to show that democracy and capitalism, for all their flaws, produced prosperity and freedom in ways that fascism and communism never could. And it worked. By the 1960s, West Germany was one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. Its citizens enjoyed a standard of living that would have been unimaginable in 1945. They had cars, televisions, washing machines, and yes, an abundance of soap and clean water. The transformation was not just economic, it was psychological. The generation that had lived through the war, that had seen the lies of the Third Reich collapse in the face of American abundance, raised their children to value democracy, freedom, and peace. Friedrich Müller lived to see that transformation. He never spoke much about the war. He rebuilt his farm, raised his children, and lived quietly. But he kept that bar of soap, or what was left of it, wrapped in cloth in a drawer. He never used it. It was a relic, a reminder. When his grandchildren asked him about it, he would take it out, hold it carefully, and tell them the story of the day he realized everything he had believed was a lie. "This," he would say, "is what defeated us. Not bombs, not tanks. This, a country so rich, so strong, that even its enemies were given dignity. That is power. That is what we lost too." In the end, the story of German prisoners stunned by American laundry and clean water is not just a story about hygiene or logistics. It is a story about ideology and its collapse. It is a story about the power of abundance to shatter certainty. It is a story about how a bar of soap, a hot shower, and a laundered uniform can become symbols of a truth too large to ignore. The men who stood in those showers in the spring of 1945 had fought for a vision of the world built on domination, scarcity, and control. They had been told they were superior, that their enemies were weak, that their victory was inevitable. And then they were captured, and they were given soap. They were given clean water. They were given food, medicine, and dignity. And in that simple act of generosity, the entire edifice of Nazi ideology began to crumble. It is easy to see the end of the war as a story of military triumph, of tanks and planes and strategic brilliance. And it is. But it is also a story of laundry, of soap, of clean water, of the quiet, undeniable power of a system that produces so much abundance it can afford to be generous even to its enemies. That is the lesson Friedrich Müller learned in that warehouse, standing under a stream of hot water with a bar of soap in his hands. That is the lesson he carried with him for the rest of his life. That is the lesson we forget at our peril. The war was won on the battlefield, but the peace was won in the laundry. And sometimes, history turns not on the grand gestures, but on the smallest acts of human decency. A bar of soap, a clean shirt, a moment of dignity restored. That is what stunned the German prisoners in 1945. Not the defeat, not the destruction, but the simple, undeniable fact that the enemy they had been taught to hate had treated them better than their own government ever did. And in that realization, the old world ended, and a new one began.